Using the old carburetor sizing formula and breathing through a drinking straw is exactly the same. You get a carburetor that's too small and you just can't breathe. The truth is, bigger is usually better. If I would have followed that age-old formula, I'd barely have the need for 600 CFM. You see, I've never had a 600 or even a 650 CFM carburetor on this 383. I've used this 750, and right now I've got a 4150 from Velocity Racing Carbs that's probably the high side of 750. But if bigger is better, where did that formula actually come from? The answer is it came from about the late 40s, early 50s, circa end of World War II. Okay, and that 3456, you get that because 1 cubic foot of air has 1,728 cubic inches. Yes, I had to look it up and write it down to get it correct. Now, since the traditional 4-stroke engine goes around twice, you double that, you get to 3,456. Okay, and if that 3456 is such a constant in physics, why is this whole formula so wrong? Part of the answer comes in that formula was developed when carburetor, Venturi design, booster design, they were what they were, and they were operating within the confines of what was known, and in that time, a lot of manufacturing practices have improved. The Venturi designs have improved. The booster designs have improved, kind of making that old formula a little bit not so relevant anymore, but by no means is it the be-all, end-all. It'll get you close, maybe. Now, a slightly more modern take on that whole formula is basically cubic inch times by RPM times by volumetric efficiency divided by 2860. But I also recognize that there may be room for improvement. Keep in mind that my 750 has been worked over a little bit and is probably a little bit higher than that, which puts me in the possibly overcarbed category. But it works. And I've even heard some guys say that that number that you get there off that formula should be considered the absolute maximum size you should ever see, and that realistically 85% of that would be about right. Seriously? I don't know about you, but that sounds really wrong. Even the OEM started to realize that that age-old formula wasn't working. You could find Q-jets that flowed close to 800 CFM on engines as small as 305 cubic inches. Now I know what you're thinking. How dare you bring a Q-jet into this? They had tiny primaries for throttle response, as well as fuel economy and a handful of other emissions era related things. Now granted, the Q-jet was being used as early as about 1965 or 6, give or take a little bit, but it just goes to show that engines truthfully needed a little bit more breathing space than they were getting. That's why dual quad carburetors were so big in the late 50s through the early 60s. The best way to get more carburation? Add another carburetor, because they only flow 500 CFM, give or take a little bit. Now I know what you're thinking. Okay, Eric, Mr. Smart Guy, how can you get by with having a carburetor that's too big? Well, the answer is it has to do a lot with the booster design. I run annular boosters almost exclusively when I can do it. And the answer is that improves the throttle response of the carburetor and just makes the carburetor work better. But there's a couple more things to it, such as optimizing the path of flow, creating high velocity through the Venturis and the boosters, and generally making a carburetor that works well. And I recognize that in the OE applications, like the Q-Jet, modifying or adapting a carburetor for maximum airflow in a high production environment probably wasn't conducive to keeping the costs low of production. Okay. Now if you're putting a new carburetor on your cruiser as an example, not a race car, how much carburetor do you really need? Well, if you start off with the formula as an example, let's use the traditional 350-inch small block Chevy, and it's going to see a maximum of 5,500 RPM, you'll be able to see that you'll come up with the size that at least gets you in the ballpark. But the truth of the matter is that a 650 is probably where you're going to wind up. And if you go by all the math, that 650 is probably too big. And many internet experts will claim that you don't need anything bigger than a 500 or 550 CFM carburetor. If you're going to do that, you might as well just put a 2-barrel on it and have no fun whatsoever. And I want to be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that old style calculation. It works. It'll get you by, but you may be leaving a fair bit of horsepower on the table. My dad was building his 64 Buick Special. Small block Chevy, 60 over, like 360 inches, give or take a little bit. We had a suspicion that it was going to need more than that 650 CFM carburetor also. A lot of people were telling us, no, if you do that, that car's going to fall on its face. You know something? That car ran pretty darn good with a 750 on it. And years later, there was a very specific class. And my dad wanted to slow the car down, so we tried a couple of things, disconnecting the secondaries, but it just wasn't giving the results that he was looking for. So he spent some money, picked up a 650 CFM carburetor to slow the car down about 0.4 of a second. And you know something? It never ran as good as that 750. The 750 had better throttle response, it generally worked better, and it just wasn't worth the effort that we put into slowing the car down to meet this very specific class. The bigger carburetor flat out worked better. Totally fun factoid. Both me and my dad picked up a pair of Demons at the same time, and they both have served admirably. This is the one that I had. My dad still has his with his Buick. I've made the move to this Velocity. It generally has better atomization characteristics, flat out works better. Not saying that this wouldn't, that just works better, and that one's been worked over a lot more than this off-the-shelf Demon. Years ago, Engine Masters did this dyno challenge where they put this cubic inch formula to the test, and what they found was that when they followed the formula, they were leaving substantial horsepower on the table. So they did what any sensible hot rodder would do. Try the next size up and the next size up. And they actually found they had to go a lot bigger than they were expecting before horsepower started to degrade and throttle response started to go away. OEs knew that perhaps that carburetor sizing formula was a little bit too conservative than it should have been. They've been using a lot bigger carburetors for engines that shouldn't necessarily have a carburetor that big and have been being able to make sufficiently good throttle response to keep the average consumer happy. Now, there's also a movement towards, in the racing carburetor side of things, the new twin blade carburetors that don't have 4 holes. Instead, it's 2 long oval-shaped throttle blades. It would be very safe to say that those would move a lot more air than their traditional 4-holed counterparts. And they're moving upwards of 1100-1200 CFM in a 4150 body without any sweat whatsoever. And a lot of the racers are finding that even with those big carburetors, the throttle response is better because the throttle bore design is optimized for velocity and making sure that it flows correctly to optimize the boosters that are on there. You see, more of this is a battle of optimize the booster as opposed to having a CFM rating that is just a blanket statement of this much air can pass through those Venturis. You see, half of part of what makes Rochester work isn't necessarily those tiny primaries, but the fact that they have a triple Venturi in there. The intent is to maximize the velocity through the boosters for maximum fuel atomization and throttle response. So even though they were doing it with a tiny little primary, they were still optimizing the booster. And optimizing the booster, this is why I'm such a big fan of the annular boosters, because it atomizes the fuel so much better, more efficiently. The traditional old straight leg or down leg booster tended to create large globules of fuel that wouldn't necessarily atomize, whereas the annular booster that allow for some significantly better fuel atomization. So realistically, you could have better throttle response with a bigger carburetor as long as it has better atomization. I want to hear from you. What size carburetor and what size engine do you have in your hot rod? Did you trust your gut or did you follow that formula? And also, are you just researching so that way you get the right carburetor for your hot rod? Thanks for watching, guys, and if you like this one, check this one out over here.